we have a tendency to overvalue when we think about team dynamics, when we think about how do we want to fix team dynamics, make teams better, make teams more effective. We tend to focus basically on firefighting. We think about, okay, what do? I look in, I see that something's broken, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to fix it. That's my job as the team leader. Or I look in and I see something and go, hey, that's a really good behavior. That's a good dynamic. Let me try to fan the flames and make it go bigger. That's actually just not a very good approach, because it takes too much time, too much effort for leaders to be doing this sort of active role. What we really want to do is focus people on getting the design right, getting the setup right, getting the context right, and the enabling conditions, and that's the term that we're using, in order for the teams to naturally work in the right direction.
Thank you, Mark, for joining me today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you again for having me.
To kick things off, I wanted a really broad question to get us into things. When it comes to teamwork, you talk a lot, and in some of your articles I've read about the enabling conditions of teamwork. What are these enabling conditions, and why are they so important for teams?
For me, one of the big issues, and I'm not going to claim credit for this. This builds on a lot of foundational work done by Richard Hackman. So this has a long history and a lot of research. Amy Edmondson, who's I know one of the other distinguished speakers, also has worked a lot with Richard. One of the things that Richard argued, and I found very, very true in a lot of organizations I've worked with, is we have a tendency to overvalue when we think about team dynamics, when we think about how do we want to fix team dynamics, make teams better, make teams more effective. We tend to focus basically on firefighting. We think about, okay, what do? I look in, I see that something's broken, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to fix it. That's my job as the team leader. Or I look in and I see something and go, hey, that's a really good behavior. That's a good dynamic. Let me try to fan the flames and make it go bigger. One of the things that Richard argued, and one of the things that I've found, and it really, really holds true, is that's actually just not a very good approach, because it takes too much time, too much effort for leaders to be doing this sort of active role. What we really want to do is focus people on getting the design right, getting the setup right, getting the context right, and the enabling conditions, and that's the term that we're using, in order for the teams to naturally work in the right direction. This is one of the things that I'll be talking about. So what are the types of things we're talking about? We're talking about a lot of things that should ring true with the audience. We're going to be talking about things like the direction, right? The goals and the motivation. What is it that we're trying to move towards? We're going to talk about the way in which the team is designed and the setup. That includes the composition, that includes the tasks that people are engaged in, that sort of thing. We're talking about the environment of the organization that the team sits in, so the broader context as well. And particularly when we're talking about working globally and virtually, we're talking about a mindset and about whether or not that mindset is shared across all the people within that team. So what I want to talk to everybody about is getting them to think about not managing a team or leading a team by stepping in and saying, let me fix the problems, let me do the stuff, but rather by saying, what we really want to do is before that, actually try to make sure that the setup is right in the first place. And if things are going wrong, to use that mindset to help diagnose and figure out where things are going awry.
So getting the process right is obviously incredibly important. Getting the system right is obviously incredibly important for developing teams. And this brings me into my second question, which has got to do with the rise of digital technologies, digital HR, digital business, digital workplace. It's everywhere. Becomes sort of the new agile, to use the air quotes of agile term. One of the things that we've seen with the rise of digital technologies is, in some sense, the complexity of long distance teams, of distributed teams, of even within an organization in the same building has reduced. There are tools to manage complexity. But there is also a kickback against that. And we've seen with the rise of the complicated workplace, what can you do to, as a leader and for your team, to diagnose the potential for digital overload?
So the challenge here is, I think that's about 12 questions in one, all of which are really good and really interesting and things that I'd love to talk about. I think, so a couple of things that I want to flag in that. One, I agree 100% with what you said. You know, the idea of digital and digitalization and everything is what everybody is talking about. One thing that I've seen, everybody has a different definition of what that means. And so, you know, one of the very first steps is to make sure that we're actually having the same conversation and speaking the same language. For some, it's purely about the tools that people are using to communicate. For others, it's about different processes and protocols for the way in which we do our work. And for others, it's yet further things. So I think one of the big challenges we have is first, just making sure we're having the same conversation. Now, the second piece, I half agree and half disagree. You sort of framed it as we have technologies to reduce the complexity. We have technologies that help us to bridge gaps. I don't think I would go so far as to say that they reduce the complexity. In fact, I think in many cases they actually increase the complexity, but they do and fully accept that they do allow us to do things we weren't otherwise able to do. I am not able right now, we're having this conversation, we're not face to face, we are actually having a virtual conversation right now. That's not something I would be able to do because our schedules and things don't necessarily work out. So the technology does allow us to have this conversation, which we wouldn't otherwise be able to have. The flip side, however, is we have a tendency to view technology as a panacea. Great, so we fixed the problem because now I can have the conversation. Problem is, we are still, as human beings, social animals. We're basing all of our interactions on some odd million years of evolution in which we haven't had all these technologies, where we've had to actually look at one another in the eyes and, a few million years back, grunt, but now at least we can have an intelligent conversation. But everything in our makeup is designed around a face-to-face interaction. So one of the problems that I see is that very often people say, great, now we solved the problem because we have this really awesome new telepresence technology, and I can see every pore on your face. I can hear you breathing because the audio is so good, the video is so good. And we then assume that that means everything is fixed. What we forget is there's a huge amount of additional information and context that we lose by not being in the same place. Third little piece is, you mentioned overload. Absolutely. And I see this all the time, and I see this in all organizations I work with, whether you're talking about people, honestly, at the shop floor all the way up to the boardroom. We are tethered to and overloaded by massive amounts of information. And one of our biggest challenges now is not about access to information, but it's about attention and allocation of attention to the right things. And it's about how do we sort and filter the information that we have access to. And that's some work that I'm doing right now with a number of colleagues, really looking at how the changing nature of teams and team boundaries and the way in which we think about and constitute them is actually shaping fundamentally the way in which we pay attention to things. And it changes the role that attention plays in actually being a core structural element of our organizations. Is actually no longer the boundary, but it's actually the attention that we draw in our behaviors.
Recently, we've all found out that the open offices haven't been the solution that they were all once purported to be. And it's very curious to sort of entertain this question, because I would have assumed that more face-to-face interaction in a large office space tends to more high-performing teams, whereas it doesn't seem to be the case. So what's going on there?
Ironically or not ironically, one of the co-authors on exactly the study that I was just talking about looking at attention is Ethan Bernstein, who was one of the key authors talking about these ideas about open offices. So I know Ethan very well, and we've talked a lot about this. Part of what's happening, again, is in traditional teams, in closed offices and traditional ways of working, we're able to rely on everything from physical space to organizational structure as a crutch to help direct us and to focus what we do. With open offices, the upside, the promise of the open office is, look, we get to talk to everybody. We have all these additional conversations. Look at what this will do for our network, right? I used to not talk to everybody, and so there's information out here in our organization that I didn't get that I could benefit from. This is the classic phrase HB always used to say, if HB only knew what HB knows. I've heard versions of that for about 10 different companies. We all know what that's like. So the idea is open office, now everybody knows everything. The problem is when you're hit with everything all at once, it's really hard to figure out which is the noise and which is the signal. And that's one of the big problems that we have, is we now have to deal with tremendous amounts of distraction that we weren't dealing with in the past. Now, honestly, we're not that great at dealing with. And so we now have to try to figure out, how do we manage that? How do we marshal our attention and what we do to make sure that we're actually doing the most high yield? Part of it also becomes a situation where we may be putting in effort, but 80-20 rule really holds true pretty much everywhere in the universe. the biggest yield comes from a small number of things. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to do all 100%. There's 20% that gives you 80% of the value. The problem is the open office environment gives you 100% of the stuff. You got to figure out which is the 20% you need to attend to get the biggest value.
Yeah, I think everyone out there listening who works in the open office, me included, can very much attest to that. Just carrying on with the theme of overloading and networks becoming sort of overloaded with complexity. You mentioned one of the terms you've got is multi-teaming. And I just wanted to ask you, why is multi-teaming such a double-edged sword? And to carry on, what would you like HR leaders to take into consideration when approaching the multi-teaming question?
So HR leaders are absolutely, on the first line of defense about this. So multi-teaming, the idea of multi-teaming, it's a term that's we coined, we're using to talk about something that is being done and has been done for a while now. The idea that somebody is on one team and that's the only thing they do just doesn't really hold. So people are being pulled in these multiple different directions. Now, the allure, again, the upside is, great, I drive slack out of my organization, bench time, all the negative terms about what happens when you have those lazy employees who are just sitting around doing nothing because their project is slow. We get rid of that because when they're slow on this, they go to something else. Wonderful. The flip side is you don't control when they go necessarily. The flip side is you don't necessarily control when each project ramps up or ramps down. And so now what we've introduced a new issue, a new challenge. And this is something that I talked about in the article with Heidi Gardner. We talked about human capital interdependence. We've introduced a new type of interdependence that most organizations aren't measuring. They're not thinking about, and they're therefore not controlling for and protecting against. Organizations spend a huge amount of time, effort, and money protecting themselves against interactions, against interdependencies within their supply chain and other elements. What we don't often think about is the interdependencies that come up from the way in which we actually staff our projects. And this is obviously very much in the domain and the purview of HR, who in any organization have one of the best views on the way in which the structures through which teams and projects and even divisions, larger groups, are interconnected. This is something we need to be thinking more and more about in order to be able to manage this, because this becomes a very significant potential source of risk for an organization. And the more people are working in this sort of fashion, in addition, the more that people are working also as short-term contract work, so they're working not just for your company, but for other companies as guns for hire, the more this is going to be an even bigger risk.
With the continuation of the fourth industrial revolution, what do you think the teams of the next 10 years or so, or the high-performing teams, I should say, how do you think they are going to operate? So what is going to separate the high-performing teams of 2028 from, say, the not so well-performing, underperforming teams?
I think there's going to be a really big question of whether or not we recognize it as a team in the first place. You mentioned before Agile, and everybody loves to talk about Agile and Scrum, and then you have derivative forms and all this other stuff, all of which are basically moving towards a substitution of formal structure for process, or formal structure for relationships and a more adaptive sort of approach. Now, one of the fundamental things that causes is, again, a breakdown of the notion of the standalone team as an entity. And this is where, again, we've talked about Amy Edmondson's work on teaming. This is a very, very seminal element of this. It's very much connected to a lot of my work on confusion over team boundaries, on multi-teaming, and all of this. All of this work is going very much in the same direction. And in my mind, it's telling very much the same story, that the classic model of the team as a group of people who sit around a table and do work is becoming harder and harder to find. It still exists, obviously, but I think as we start projecting further into the future, what we're going to see is a much more adaptive, dynamic, and fluid model of staffing that then starts to make us ask questions about how we apply all the lessons of years past on teams and collaboration and how we work well together to this new environment. I think what we're going to see is just a much more fluid vision of the way in which people work together, and what a team is going to be more like a snapshot in a movie. It's going to be like taking a still frame in a movie rather than saying this is a thing that exists on its own. That has very, very big implications for things like identity, for the way in which people relate to their teams, collaborators, and the organizations that they're in. It has massive, massive implications that we're working on trying to understand right now.
To wrap things up, I'm conscious of the fact you're very busy. So could you just tell our audience a little bit more about what they can expect from your masterclass in a few sentences, and obviously from your keynote as well?
Sure. So in a nutshell, in the keynote, I really want to talk about, again, this is the idea of the overcommitted organization, to talk about some of these issues around multi-teaming, some of these issues around risk, what that looks like. We've been doing a lot of work recently analyzing this both in the field and also using computer simulations and models. So we have some really good ways of thinking about and understanding what this risk really looks like, ways to mitigate it, ways to understand it, and in particular to think about it at different levels, to think about it at the level of the organization, at the level of the team itself, and at the level of the individual. And this is one of the challenges about this, is it really operates at all three of those levels. Within the masterclass, it's really to do a deep dive talking about collaboration and teamwork. It's to think about and to do this in a very applied, hands-on sort of way. So what I want to do is to walk people through a way of thinking about making sure that your teams are set up the right way, a way of thinking about taking that and then applying it into real-world situations and having people in the masterclass actually doing some analysis of their own team, so they walk away not only with a new tool, a way of thinking about this that can be both used small scale and large scale within their organizations, but also with some concrete recommendations about particular teams that they're wrestling with.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much once again for joining me today. If there's any way that people want to get in contact with you, how can they do so?
Best bet is email is always a good option. Just mark.mortensen@ncad.edu. That's the easiest. I'm also I have a Twitter feed, that sort of thing, Prof. Mortensen. So any of those options are a good way to get hold of me. LinkedIn as well. I try to check all of them, but email's a good first bet.